So I'm presenting my paper with my co-author Divya Priyadarshini, who's also here. We're talking about construction labor in India and the invisibility of laborers from the global value chain. In the paper, I won't go into a lot of things. Like I'm not going to get into the statistics, but I just want to stress on some important things when we are discussing construction sector in India. Uh, it's a sector that hires the second highest number of people after agriculture. A lot of people are moving from agriculture to construction and allied activities, either full-time or part-time seasonal migration. A lot of the laborers in the sector are seasonal short-term migrants who during non-cropping season, non-agriculture seasons enter the construction sector and then go back to their agriculture work. A lot of largely remain outside of the scope of or remain less visible in the global value chain and even the domestic value chain. A lot of the construction also in India happens for local consumption. Um, there are multiple levels of contracting and subcontracting, and when I go into my paper a bit, I will also be talking about how informal these contracts are, where kinship networks play a huge role in the hiring of workers. A lot of the contracts, especially in say smaller single home construction setups, are oral contracts. There aren't too many written contracts over here. And there is this pervasive informality throughout the labor supply chain. What we are doing in the chapter is we are drawing a lot from the labor paradigm and the development framework by Hila Shamir and Prabha Koteshwaran, because that helps us move away from the criminal justice response that is the predominant response to trafficking, modern slavery, etc. And then we move a little away from these two frameworks and suggest that there's a requirement for a new framework to look at, which is a bottom-up approach and could be even sector specific. Also, just briefly going through the two frameworks that we've referred to. The labor paradigm was suggested by Hila Shamir back in 2012, while Prabha Koteshwaran, who was a part of our 2019 meeting, had spoken about the development approach even during that meeting, post which there was a paper that she published. So we are drawing from those. A common thread in both these works is their criticism of the criminal justice response to trafficking, which we also sort of align with, like I mentioned. For Shamir, labor exploitation, trafficking is more like a severe form of labor exploitation, and it's a matter of degree and not of kind. For Koteshwaran's development approach, Koteshwaran criticizes Shamir's framework along the lines, especially in the Indian context, where she talks about not having a single universal development approach, but there to be local approaches when we are dealing with trafficking or labor exploitation. So she moves away from Shamir's work along the lines of that most of the hiring in India and most of the workforce in India is in the unorganized sector. So taking that into consideration, a lot of the things under the labor paradigm would probably not be the best fit for a scenario like India. We do see that in our own paper also, where we discuss the construction sector and small construction work that happens across the country. Our data is predominantly secondary. We did a small ethnographic study in Delhi. We spoke to laborers and people in the union working in Delhi, in South Delhi to be precise. In terms of legislations, I wouldn't go too much into the depth of this, but there are a few points that I want to make over here. There are a bunch of legislations that govern the construction sector specifically, and then now there is an attempt to pull together a bunch of legislations into some larger nationwide legislation on wages, industrial relations, occupational safety, health, etc. But a lot of these legislations have a minimum threshold of a certain number of workers that they require for these laws to be applicable. And the small construction units that we are talking about in our paper fall out of the purview of these legislations. On the other hand, if we look at the response, the anti-trafficking response in the country, even a bill that was recently presented that was recently released to the public, actually, not yet in the parliament, way back in July 2021. Even this bill continues to have a criminal justice response to trafficking and labor exploitation. The construction sector has some parallels with what happens under the bonded labor system, or some parallels with what we typically understand as trafficking. The concern over here is that anti-trafficking response is always looked at a very black and white sort of a segregation between the trafficked and the trafficker, which we also see in the field that it's not always true. A lot of these roles that we see between the contractor, the laborer, etc., are fluid. People might start as workers, then just get their way around the tricks of the trade, and then graduate to becoming contractors. In another place, they could go as a laborer. So we see this fluidity, and the anti-trafficking response just doesn't seem to capture this fluidity that we actually see in the ground. What we saw in the field was a lot of the contracting happens through kinfolk. We have some examples where we've seen people migrating from, say, a family migrating from a village, coming and finding work at a construction site in an urban area. They know that there are people back home who are also looking for jobs, who are facing the same job crunch, etc. And they will suggest that there is a certain work that is available in the construction sector in so and so city, and get them or just help them move from the rural area to the urban area. So a lot of hiring to the sector actually happens this way. So there isn't a contractor or a of course there are contractors and subcontractors, we're not denying the presence of that, but a lot of hiring also happens through kinfolk who can't really be labeled as subcontractors. We also see that a lot of movement, other than for economic reasons, is also because people are more confident about moving out. We also see that people want to break out of the caste-based system that is so far more predominant in rural areas. We also see people moving out because there could be a breakdown of their social relations in these rural areas. So there are these various reasons that don't quite get captured in any of the frameworks that we've referred to. We also see that because a lot of migration is circular, these people are not necessarily moving to build their houses in the urban areas they are moving to, but to sustain their lives in the villages. So you see people moving back during festival seasons, they celebrate the festivals back home, come back to the urban areas, and there's this circular migration that keeps happening. I just have a few quotes from the field that stress on the point of the kinship network that I mentioned about when it comes to hiring. And the first family that we've quoted over here was one such family that kept going back to their village for every festival, and they keep moving between construction and brick kilns. And so 6-7 months, they'll keep moving between these two places. We tried to put together a diagrammatic representation of how a supply chain looks like. So if you see, you can see the product supply chain, the horizontal one, and then you can see levels and levels of contracting, subcontracting, laborers, the kinfolk that I was talking about, laborers linking other laborers to a particular construction unit. And this creates a lot of zone of vulnerability. On both sides, because in one place because of subcontracting, on the other hand also because a lot of unskilled labor is coming into the construction sector through their labor friends. To conclude, what we've seen is that the traditional responses that we have to trafficking or forced labor, be it labor laws or be it trafficking laws, we see them to be inadequate for reasons that I've already explained. While one leaves out smaller units that we're talking about, the other has always tried to segregate an exploiter and the exploited into very separate units, which is not really true when you look at the field. Also, what happens is because of the circular migration, it becomes difficult for a lot of laws to be implemented to these people who are always on the move. To the places where they are moving, they're not permanent migrants, and to the places where they've come from, they're not even staying there long enough for them to get benefits of the laws. While we do see aspects of advances and debt that have some resemblance to labor exploitation and trafficking situations, effective responses might not be through the criminal justice system that I just mentioned about. There is a need to understand construction work within the larger context of agriculture distress, job insecurity, supply chain, and social hierarchies like of caste, that people are escaping to come to the urban areas that are reflected in hiring practices and work culture, some of which, like caste, are highly resistant to change. Another aspect that I've already spoken about is the fluidity of the roles that we saw even in the field, where we've seen people who've come as laborers just suggesting work options to others and not necessarily wholly taking up this role of a contractor or a subcontractor. So there is also the suggestion of licensing of subcontractors, which probably would not work in this case because these are not necessarily subcontractors. Nor are these traffickers, because these are just people helping their kin to find some work in another location where they know there is a possibility of finding work. So there is this fluidity of the value chains of the labor chain that isn't getting captured by the literature that we have right now, nor is it getting captured in the laws that we have right now. And that is where we are suggesting there is scope for this, for a new framework that we probably need to deal with, which can be sector specific and also, like Prabha Koteshwaran has mentioned, specific to a location or geography that would probably be more helpful in dealing with cases of migration or hiring to the construction sector. Like I said, these legislations that we have today are of limited utility for circular migrants and individual migrants not moving with a contractor or middleman. What we additionally saw during COVID times is all of these issues remained unaddressed. Plus, what was also done in many states in India was the labor regulations that we already have were further relaxed I mean, the excuse was to boost the economy, but I mean, that is definitely impacting the rights of the workers that you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saie, very much in time and very interesting work. It's definitely progressing well, and I see that you and Divya have made good improvements in this work. So thank you very much. Dev, you ready with your comments?
Yeah, yes, I am. Basically, well, it's a good paper, Saie and Divya. There is one point which you make at the end, and I would like to take that and suggest something of what you could do to take it forward. This is in fact your second last sentence. You write, this chapter hints towards the development of a new framework to understand sector-specific responses to exploitation in DVC, GVC. So my point is, why are you just hinting? Why don't you try to develop the framework based on the material which you have got? You have got a lot of material. So I think you should be able to develop a framework. I would suggest something, if I may, in that for how one could utilize this for developing a framework. For instance, we usually look at migration. 3 different kinds of people study migration. There are those who study migration from the point of view of the origin, where they come from, why do they migrate, etc. So you have a lot of studies of Bihar, which the institute I'm involved with, Institute for Human Development, has done a lot of studies of migrants from Bihar. Who are they? Why are they? Where do they go, etc. So that is one level from the destination. Then you have a lot of studies of the source. That was the source area. Then you have a lot of studies of migration at the destination. I mean, in the area where I live, which is Gurgaon, and here we have all the garment factories, and the Society for Labor and Development works on migration, issues of migrant workers in the garment industry. So you have a lot of problems, analysis of the problems in the destination. Then you have people who specialize in working on trafficking, which is what connects the two, or different forms of migration. Not all migration is trafficking, but they deal with different forms of recruitment, if we may say. How are people recruited from the origin A to the destination B? What I would suggest is that you need to connect all these points and these flows. You need to connect, to put in a broad way, conditions in the origin. For instance, you mentioned in your, I think in the end of your presentation, the importance of distress migration. So obviously, the question of distress migration, of who are the people who are affected by distress migration, would come up. For instance, in India, I'll give the example which you are also studying. You look at migrants from Manipur, and you look at migrants from Jharkhand, and you'll see a big difference in where they come from and where they go. Migrants from Jharkhand end up largely in, say, if they are young women, they end up in domestic service. But migrants from Manipur end up as nurses, end up in the hospitality sector, working in hotels and so on. They're at a higher level. So the conditions in origin affect your employment outcomes in the destination. Secondly, there's also a link with the manner of migration. Somebody mentioned in the discussion that the method of recruitment may leave the migrant in such a position that she has no scope for bargaining. Even if you're not trafficked, you may have little scope for bargaining. So I think we need to connect all these three: the conditions at the origin, the method of recruitment, and conditions at the destination, and also complete the circle. It doesn't just end with the destination. The destination has continuing links with the origin. For instance, we have studied garment workers. Garment workers are regularly laid off for 2 months or so in a year. So what do they do in that period? They don't stay in the urban areas. They go back to their villages. So the villages are paying part of the costs of social reproduction of their labor by supporting them for 2 months in a year. When they fall sick, other than a minor flu, well, nowadays not with COVID, but earlier on, they would go back, other than a minor flu, if it was anything longer treatment required, they would go back to the village. When they retire, where do they go? The low-paid workers do not settle in the urban areas. So they go back to their villages. So there is a reverse flow from the village to the destination area. There's also a flow from the destination to the source in terms of remittances. So you need to see these flows. You need to see the flow of income and energy between the destination and the source, and vice versa, and the methods of recruitment. So I think you have a lot of material. I'm sure you have more in the questionnaires that you have filled out. So maybe what I have suggested could be a way of putting it all together into a framework which would link the different factors that we are seeing in migration and the employment outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Saie, Divya, hopefully this is useful for you. Would you want to quickly comment on this?
I think that was helpful. It will definitely help us give some sort of framework of how we go about building this framework, and we'll definitely get back to our paper and figure out how we go ahead.
Thank you. Any more comments, questions?
Okay, I'll just add one point in that to what I said, if I may. You know, the importance of this link between the destination and the source was dramatically brought out by the absence of social security in the last recession, in the pandemic-induced recession. I mean, the workers in these, the low-paid workers could not stay in the urban areas. So what did they do? They went back to their villages. So the villages are the social, the women left behind, the households run by women left behind are the social security because of the low paid wages of these workers and the lack of government provided social security.
Thank you, Dev. Just a quick thought, Saie, Divya. I mean, it's interesting work. My hope is the way you are shaping this, you are able to connect it well to the, and because you're focusing largely in the domestic Indian domestic segment, how are you going to be connecting it to the GVC literature and scholarship in terms of and doing justice to that aspect also would be useful to think about and share. Hela, you have a thought here.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to say that I think this the project is developing really well, and I think this version is really persuasive and compelling, and raises some very, very interesting issues to think of in thinking about domestic value chains. And I think the way, kind of continuing what Bimal said, the way value chain literature, and it doesn't have to be GVC, it can be DVC for that matter, can help you is in thinking about the distribution of power and profits in this chain and how they work. I think because this is a domestic supply chain with so many subcontractors, it is so dispersed. I can only, it's interesting to think about the flow of money here and the flow of, I imagine that the direct contractors that hire the workers are actually themselves have a very narrow profit margin, though, again, I don't know. But I think it'll be interesting to think about that again and thinking about responsibility, as responsibility follows. And I think this comes from what Dev was saying earlier. If we think about the kind of the profit margin as a source to anchor normative responsibility. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And I think the other thing really, I think is the connection to issues of trafficking. And I think this is something that comes up again and again here, because we have such a capacious understanding, as we've said, of this issue as basically severe forms of labor market exploitation. I think thinking about this sector and what creates the vulnerability within the sector, and flesh it out a little more can be very helpful. And then thinking through that and how to address it and how the value chain analysis can help address it, if at all. And again, I think Dev's suggestion here is very powerful for your developing your own framework that I think can really bridge the gap between what Prabha and I think are complementary approaches, but we kind of posit them as different approaches. So I think you guys can be the bridge and present a very compelling framework here. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you have to think about being an empirical work. You will have to really think about lifting it to the conceptual, abstracted level of theoretical underpinnings. Drawing from this work is going to be important and interesting as a contribution to the work. So good luck and all the best. Any other thoughts, anyone, or should we just have a quick open house generally? Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.